Welcome to Starbound. My name is Aaron, and I'll be your narrator today. And if you love human-made HFY stories, then you can check us out on Patreon now, where you'll find exclusive episodes that you can't see anywhere else. But in the meantime, let's get to today's first story. The last file of the evening was always the humans. Not because Lelaine had planned it that way. He had worked through the cohort in the order the intake system assigned them, which was alphabetical by species designation, and humans fell where they fell. It was coincidence. He had noted it anyway, because 30 cycles of this ritual had made him attentive to the small geometry of things, and the fact that his most anomalous admission arrived at the end of his review struck him as having a certain structural tidiness, even if it meant nothing. The office had been quiet for 2 hours. The Academy's first night quiet was distinct from the quiet of other nights, and Lelaine had learned to value it. The cohort was assigned. The dormitory blocks were sealed. The administrative machinery of intake had ground through its last rotation and stilled. Outside the window, the Vauban's upper parade ground lay empty under the running lights, the pale stone catching the blue-white wash of the perimeter array. He had stood at this window for 30 cycles of first nights. The view had not changed. The Academy had stood on this site for longer than the current coalition had existed, and its corridors had absorbed 40 generations of cadets, and emerged from the experience with no visible opinion of any of them. The newest cohort would not change this. They never did. He had found this reassuring once, early in his tenure, when the continuity of the institution had felt like something that supported him. 43 cadets, 11 species. The numbers were unremarkable for a mid-cycle intake. Intake quality correlated poorly with its size. He had built the rubric to be size-agnostic. He was satisfied with this. He worked through the files with the efficiency of long practice. A Garnath in the upper third of the cohort, reach index in the expected range but fractionally above baseline, a measurement you noted without excitement. A Krev whose density index sat well above the cohort mean in precisely the direction the Krev always produced. The numbers behaving as numbers should, which Lelaine found professionally satisfying in a way he had never bothered to interrogate. 3 Polari, all clustered at the lighter end of the skeletal index, which was a Polari characteristic and not a concern in itself. He flagged the file of the lightest of the 3 for Kahanamoko, who would need to modify the sparring protocols for the opening assessment bouts. His senior instructor disliked modified protocols on principle. He would grumble about it in the way he grumbled about everything that was not a direct failure of the person in front of him. Briefly, and without expecting a response, Lelaine had never pointed out that the grumbling and the compliance arrived together, always in that order, because the grumbling did not impede the compliance, and therefore was not a problem. He saw no benefit in treating things that were not problems as if they were. He moved on. The human's file arrived in its place at the end. He opened it the same way he had opened the other 42. Assessment data first. Intake photograph second. Biographical notes third. He had built the review order himself, in his second cycle as commandant, when he had observed a tendency in junior intake staff to let biographical context color their reading of the numbers. The numbers carried no context with them. The biography did. He had corrected the tendency in himself before he corrected it in anyone else, because that was the only order in which the correction held, and he had maintained it in every intake officer who had served under him since. The numbers were the finding. The biography was the note at the bottom of the page. The assessment data for Cadet Jonathan Weissmuller, human, first-year intake. Height, within standard human range, slightly below the cohort mean. Mass, within standard human range, unremarkable. Reach index, below cohort mean. Muscle density, within standard human range, unremarkable. Skeletal density index, 4.7. The scanner had flagged it. The flag was automated, which meant it had triggered on the threshold condition rather than on any judgment, but Lelaine read it with the same attention he gave a manual flag, because the threshold had been set by someone, and the reason for setting it there was worth knowing. The flag read, Probable calibration artifact. Reading falls outside all recorded coalition species parameters. Normalized per standard protocol. Below the flag, in the normalized column, 1.4. Lalaine read the original figure again. Then the flag. Then the normalized figure. The scanner had done what the scanner was designed to do. Encountered a reading that fell outside the expected range, identified it as an anomaly, applied the averaging clause, and produced a number that sat within the range of the plausible. This was correct procedure. He had written the protocol himself. He accepted the override and continued. Physical threat index. 43rd of 43. Last in the cohort. By a margin that was itself notable. A mathematical fact, not a judgment. He looked at the intake photograph. Medium height, medium build, the proportions of a species that had arrived in the galaxy recently enough that there was still only one of them in the cohort. A face that required a second look to remember, and would require a third look in a crowd. He noted the surname and the unofficial designation listed in the biographical notes. Tarzan. A hereditary nickname, the notes explained, passed down through a line of descent from a man who had portrayed a fictional character across a sequence of centuries-old entertainment recordings. Lalaine read this, understood it as the kind of human biographical detail that was both exact and functionally irrelevant, and moved past it. The Terran delegation had been pressing for inclusion in Vauban Academy's program for 8 cycles. The pressure had been consistent, diplomatic, and had, in the end, yielded the outcome that consistent diplomatic pressure reliably produced. Weissmuller's enrollment was the result. He was not expected to distinguish himself. He was expected to complete the course at a standard that permitted the delegation to file it under proof of concept and return to the longer conversation about integration timelines. Lalaine was not unkind about this. He understood the function of symbolic admissions as he had, on occasion, found that a symbolic admission produced an outcome that was something other than symbolic. He did not expect this here, but he held the category open, because 30 cycles had taught him that closing categories early was a form of error he could not afford. He made the one notation the file required. Diplomatic admission, Terran delegation, standard monitoring protocol. He closed the file. The office was quiet. Outside, the running lights held their blue-white wash over the empty stone. 43 cadets, sealed into their dormitory blocks, beginning the first night of the rest of whatever they were going to become. Lalaine set the intake files aside, took the cup of caf from his desk, and found it had gone cold some time ago. He noted this without feeling, drank what was left, and began to think about the morning. The files would mean more after the first assessments. The cohort had settled in. 6 weeks into the cycle, Lalaine took to the gallery. He did this once a week, unannounced, at no fixed time. The cadets knew he did it. They did not know when, which was the point. Kahanamako also knew. Had known for the entirety of his 35 years at the academy, and had never once adjusted his conduct on account of it. It was one of several reasons Lalaine considered him the best instructor the institution had produced. You could not teach someone to perform correctly whether observed or not, if you only performed correctly when you were. He took his place at the gallery rail and looked down at the floor. The sparring hall was a room that had only ever had one purpose, and showed it. Tiered stone seating rose behind him, empty at this hour. Below, the assessment floor was clean and unmarked, lit from panels set into the ceiling at an angle that left no shadows at ground level. Nothing decorative. The academy held the view that decoration communicated something about what a space was for, and this space's function required no such communication. Kahanamako was running the cohort through warm-up exercises while announcing the preliminary bout pairings. He stood at the edge of the floor, not at the center, which was a choice Lalaine had noted across 30 cycles of watching him work. An instructor who stood at the center of a floor told the cadets where to look. An instructor who stood at the edge left the cadets to read the floor themselves, which was where they learned the useful information. The cohort had been moving for 40 minutes before Lalaine arrived. They did not break rhythm when he took to the rail. They were 6 weeks in, which meant they had learned at minimum how to pretend. Kahanamoko himself was exactly what 35 years in post produced if you started with the right material. Long cable-strong limbs, tawny gold skin unmarked by anything that had not been earned. He moved through the hall the way water moved through a channel it had cut for itself. Without hesitation, without waste, without any apparent awareness that not moving that way was an option. The cadets oriented toward him when he crossed their sightlines. They did it without being told to. Lelaine had seen instructors spend entire careers trying to produce that effect through authority. Kahanamoko produced it through fact. The pairings ran in sequence. Lelaine watched, tracked, filed. A Garnath against a Krev, both in the upper density band, the bout producing contact that was educational for everyone present. Two of the Polari, their modified protocols holding. The bout clean and controlled, and almost entirely without incident. A mid-cohort pairing that told him something about lateral movement he filed for later consideration. Then, Weissmuller. His opponent was a cadet Lelaine had noted at intake primarily for unremarkability. A species he had not previously encountered, smooth-skinned and pale, lightly built, with a lean frame that indexed exactly where you expected it to index. Nothing in the file had flagged. Nothing in the first 6 weeks had produced a revision. They were here to provide the floor with a bout, not a lesson, and that was a legitimate function. The bout opened. Standard engagement. Both cadets reading each other with the careful attentiveness of first assessment. Weissmuller moved with the compact economy of someone who had trained and knew the difference between movement and wasted movement. His guard was good. His footwork was unremarkable in the way that competent footwork was unremarkable, which was to say it did what it was supposed to do without drawing attention to itself. His opponent found an opening on the forearm. A clean strike, decent force, well placed. Contact that produced a flinch, or a pullback, or at minimum a fractional disruption of weight distribution in any normally indexed cadet. Weissmuller absorbed it. Not stoically. Not through visible effort. He absorbed it the way a wall absorbs a knock, registering the contact, processing it, declining to rearrange itself around impact. A slight shifting of attention, the mild assessment of someone who had noted that something had happened and was deciding, without urgency, whether it warranted a response. His opponent shook out their hand. It was a small movement, brief, automatic, the kind you made when the thing you had just struck reminded your hand that it had struck something substantial. Not an injury, a reminder. The cadet recovered immediately and returned their guard, and the bout continued. And Lelaine watched from the gallery and ran his instinctive check. Mass, reach, index. The index read 1.4. He looked at Weissmuller's forearm, then at his opponent's hand, and found a satisfactory explanation without difficulty. Assessment conditions produced a focus in some cadets, an elevation that could account for anomalous impact absorption. He had seen it before. A cadet who needed to prove something, or who had learned early to manage pain, or who had simply been trained in a system that prioritized not showing the hit. Any of these were plausible. All of them resolved against 1.4 without remainder. He filed it and returned his attention to the bout. The bout concluded. Kahanamoko called it, moved on, and ran the next pairing. Lelaine watched 3 more bouts with the focused patience of someone who was here to assess the cohort, not to confirm what he already knew about it. Then, Kahanamoko stepped onto the floor. Not standard. Every cadet who had been paying attention, which was all of them, registered it within a heartbeat. There was a stillness, brief, unanimous. The cohort recalibrating around the fact of a change in the room's geometry. Kahanamoko did not explain himself. He looked at Weissmuller.
Cadet.
One word. Weissmuller stepped forward. Lelaine read the pedagogy immediately and approved of it. Object lesson, cleanly constructed. The cohort's least flagged cadet against its most decorated instructor. Not cruelty. The opposite of cruelty. Weissmuller settled, feet angled in the configuration of the human letter L. Weight back, guard up. Present. Not nervous, not eager, not performing either quality. He looked at Kahanamoko with the attentiveness of someone who understood they were here to learn something, and had not yet determined what it was. Kahanamoko read him. Lalaine could see it from the gallery, the way you could see the calculation running in someone who had been running it for more than 3 decades. Surface, mass, weight distribution, shoulder load. The intake data confirmed by the eye confirmed by the data. Everything legible, everything consistent with 43rd of 43. The match moved. 2 exchanges, probing. Kahanamoko reading the footwork, finding the weight transfer, locating the geometry of the target. Lalaine tracked it from the gallery with the ease of someone who had watched this instructor run this lesson before, across many cohorts and many years. He knew where it was going. He had thrown this kick himself, in his own time on this floor, and he knew exactly what it did to a target of this indexed density. Kahanamoko loaded the kick. Weight transfer, hip rotation, the full commitment of a lateral strike aimed at the outer thigh. 3 beats ahead of contact. Lalaine saw it and knew it and had already filed the outcome. The kick launched. The sound arrived a fraction after the visual. This was normal. The gallery was 30 feet above the floor, and sound traveled at the speed sound traveled, and Lalaine had stood in this gallery enough times to have internalized the gap. He registered it without registering it, the way you registered the weight of your own hands. He saw the kick land. Textbook. Full lateral contact, outer thigh, exactly where Kahanamoko had aimed it. He saw Weissmuller's body register the contact, a slight roll of the ankle outward, a fractional redistribution of weight, the micro-adjustment a trained fighter made when absorbing a strike. Automatic. Correct form. Weissmuller kept his guard up. Kahanamoko did not. What happened to Kahanamoko's leg was not gradual. There was no sequence of events to track. No cascade Lalaine could have caught at an earlier point if he had been watching more closely. The kick landed. The leg received the information. The leg's response to the information was not the response the leg had been giving for 35 years of assessments on this floor and on others. Then, the sound arrived. Lalaine had heard bones break before. In the ring and in the field, at close range and at distance, in contexts where the sound was anticipated, and in contexts where it was not. The sound was always wrong in the same direction in his experience, always quieter than expectation set it up to be. Impact produced noise. The body was loud in other registers, but the actual structural event was smaller than you were prepared for. This was consistent across every instance he had ever accumulated. He had accepted it as a fact about the world. This sound was not quieter. It arrived in the gallery the way structural failures arrived, with something load-bearing giving way. Not a crack, not the sharp report of a clean break. Something with more mass to it, more finality. The sound of a system that had been asked a question it had no answer for and had resolved the question by ceasing to function. Simultaneously, there was another sound. Loud, short, controlled. The kind a body made when the pain arrived faster than the will could meet it. They crossed the 30 feet of air together between the assessment floor and the gallery rail, arrived in Lalaine's ears, and he stood very still, and did not, for a moment, move at all. The cadets nearest Kahanamoko took a step back from him as he crumpled to the floor. Not from threat, from reflex. 2 other cadets were already moving to him. The medical team came from their station at the wall. He did not catch himself. This told Lalaine something important about the speed and totality of the structural failure. Kahanamoko had been falling and catching himself for more than 3 decades. The failure had been complete enough to remove that option before it was available. Around him, the hall was already moving. Inside him, something else was happening. Not shocked silence. Lalaine had been in rooms where shock silenced people, and those rooms had a charge to them, a held breath, waiting for someone to release it. This was different. This was 43 cadets performing rapid, unwilled recalculation, all of them simultaneously, at various speeds and with varying degrees of success. Something had happened that did not belong inside the category they had filed it under, and they were all, in their separate ways, trying to locate the file it actually belonged in. The silence had a texture to it. The friction of understanding, trying to find its footing on a surface that had changed without warning. Lalaine ran the calculation. Angle, correct. Force, standard assessment load, well within safe parameters for the indexed target. The force appeared to have been appropriate for the target. He had watched the geometry from the gallery and the geometry had been correct. Target, confirmed contact, outer thigh, full lateral strike, exactly as intended. He ran the calculation again. The same answer came back. Angle correct. Force appropriate, target confirmed. Technique without error from load to contact. Not a degree of deviation in any variable he had tracked. All inputs within expected parameters. The output outside all expected parameters. He ran the calculation a third time. The answer was consistent across all 3 runs. The calculation was consistent, and the calculation was wrong. Or the variables were wrong, or his understanding of what the variables described was wrong. One of these 3 things was true. He did not yet know which one, and the not knowing sat in his chest that he did not have an immediate category for. The target did not appear to have registered it as such. Lalaine considered this and had no useful response to it. The absence of a useful response was itself a data point of a sort he had not collected in 30 cycles of this post. Kahanamoko was speaking, which told him the man was conscious and oriented, and what he was saying, clipped and controlled even now, told him that the pain was being managed by sheer force of professional conditioning. That, at least, was consistent with everything Lalaine knew about him. He looked at Weissmuller. Weissmuller had lowered his guard. The match was clearly over, and he had responded to that fact with the unhurried practicality of someone who did not need to be told. He was looking at his own leg. Not at Kahanamoko. Not at the cadets who had moved to help. Not at the gallery. At his own leg, with an expression Lalaine studied from 30 feet above and could not immediately classify. It was not triumph. Nothing in it read as triumph, satisfaction, or the suppressed version of either that a cadet might attempt to conceal under observation. It was not surprise. It was not the expression of someone who had expected this outcome, but it was also not the expression of someone for whom the outcome was entirely outside the range of things that happened in the world. It was the expression of a structural engineer looking at a load-bearing element that it held under conditions it had not been formally rated for. Mild, professional, faintly relieved. Somewhere near the front of the floor, one of the cadets said something in their own language. Lalaine did not speak it, but he understood the register without needing the words. It was the register of someone who had just watched a thing happen that they would be describing for the rest of their life. Lalaine was already moving toward the stairs. He took the stairs at a pace that was not quite urgent. He kept the same not quite urgent pace down the corridors to the medical station. In medical, Kahanamoko was speaking with the medics in the clipped cadence of a man dictating, rather than being treated. The prognosis was what Lalaine had expected once he had confirmed the nature of the breaks. Brinell bone knit cleanly if set correctly in given time, the structural integrity restoring to something close enough to its original specifications that the difference was academic. 12 weeks off the floor minimum, possibly 16, depending on how the bones healed and the physiotherapy progressed. The senior medic had added, without ceremony, that the leg would likely inform him of approaching weather systems for the remainder of his life. Kahanamoko had received this information with the same expression he had given the timeline. The expression of a man who found it professionally unacceptable and personally irrelevant, because it was what it was and his opinion of it would not change it. Lalaine processed the prognosis and set it aside. He stood in the empty sparring hall for a moment after the cohort had been dismissed. He had not decided to go there. He had simply found himself there. The hall had the feel of a room that had recently held something significant and been emptied of it. The floor was clean. The lighting was unchanged. Nothing in the room indicated what had happened, which was the correct state for an assessment floor. He found it faintly strange, standing here now. He was aware that he was looking for something the room was not going to show him, and that the awareness did not stop him from looking. He looked at the spot on the floor where Weissmuller had been standing when the kick landed. The floor offered nothing. He was not sure what he had expected it to offer. He returned to his office. He pulled Weissmuller's intake file and opened it on his desk. The assessment data was as he had left it 6 weeks ago, as it would always be, because intake data did not revise itself to accommodate subsequent events. Skeletal density index, 4.7. Still there, still flagged. Probable calibration artifact. Reading falls outside all recorded coalition species parameters, normalized per standard protocol. Below it, in the normalized column, 1.4. He sat with this for a moment. Then he pulled the scanner's full calibration log for intake day. This took longer than he would have liked, because the calibration logs were filed in a different database from the intake records, a structural inefficiency he had noted before and not yet resolved. He found the log. He read it. The scanner had been functioning correctly on intake day. Every other reading in the cohort cross-checked against known baselines within acceptable variance. The Garnath's reach index confirmed against prior Garnath intake data from 9 previous cycles. The Krev's density index confirmed against 6 prior Krev intakes. The Polari figures confirmed. The scanner had not drifted. The scanner had not failed. It was working correctly when it read 4.7. He set the calibration log aside. He pulled the assessment record for Weissmuller's preliminary bout, earlier that same session. The bout record was brief. Engagement notes, duration, outcome, assessment. At the bottom, under medical notes, minor metacarpal bruising, right hand, opposing cadet. Contact with Cadet Weissmuller during sparring assessment. No further action required. Lelane read it once. He looked at the skeletal density index in the open intake file. He read the medical note again. The 2 numbers sat on the desk in front of him, did not move, and for a moment he simply looked at them, the way you looked at something that had been in the room the entire time. The opponent's hand, Weissmuller's forearm, the same arithmetic, at a smaller scale. 6 weeks before the floor of the sparring hall had produced a silence with texture. He had watched the opponent shake out their hand and filed it. The medical note had been sitting in the record the entire time. The data had been in the file twice before Kahanamoko's leg made it something he could no longer ignore. He sat with this for longer than a moment. It was not grief, and it was not embarrassment. Those were responses calibrated for failures of effort or judgment, and this was not that kind of failure. He had not been careless. He had not been lazy. He had read every data point correctly and processed each one through the best instrument he had, which was the rubric he had built over 28 cycles, and the rubric had given him the answer the rubric was constructed to give. The wall he had been leaning against his entire career had quietly stepped 3 inches to the left. Not a collapse, not a crisis, a recalibration, quiet and total, of the distance between where he had thought the wall was and where it turned out to have been standing all along. He opened the intake assessment rubric on his desk. He navigated to Section 7, Skeletal Density Index Protocol. He found the averaging clause. He had written it himself, in his second cycle as Commandant, when the rubric was still new enough that he could remember the reasoning behind each provision. He read it now with the close attention of someone reading a document they wrote and looking for the load-bearing assumption they had never examined. He found it in the second sentence. No species in coalition intake history has produced a skeletal density reading sufficiently divergent from its surface presentation to require a separate assessment category. Anomalous readings exceeding 2.5 standard deviations from species-adjusted expected range are therefore attributed to calibration variance and normalized accordingly. The word, therefore. He had written therefore as if the second sentence followed from the first, the way a conclusion followed from evidence. It did follow if the premise held. The premise had held for 28 cycles without exception, and the correctness of the results had made the premise invisible, because you did not examine the foundations of things that had never failed you. Because if they were failing, you would know. The results would tell you. The data and the eye agree. They have always agreed. They agreed about Weissmuller. The eye saw an unremarkable cadet. The data recorded 4.7. The rubric took 4.7, assessed the eye as more reliable, and produced 1.4 in its place. Neither the eye nor the data was wrong. Neither contained a category for the gap between the two. He had built the gap into the rubric and called it a quality control measure, and it had functioned, without his knowledge, as a blindfold. He deleted the averaging clause. He wrote 3 sentences in its place. Administrative and register without drama. They established a new protocol. Anomalous skeletal density readings were to be flagged, preserved unmodified, and cross-referenced against species origin data before any normalization was applied. The flag was not an error. The flag was the finding. He read the 3 sentences once, carefully. He filed the amendment, closed the rubric, and closed the intake file. He went to check on Kahanamoko. He walked the corridor without hurrying. The number 4.7 was in his mind, the way a recalibrated instrument sat after its first successful use. Accurate now in a way it had not been before. The reading trustworthy in a way the reading had always been, and he had never had the framework to recognize. The scanner had been correct from the first day. It had simply been reporting in a language the rubric did not have a word for. It had a word for it now.